has had a rough couple of days.
Mommy wasn't home?
No.
Oh.
Fireworks.
Oh.
Yeah. We are not happy with fireworks. And thunderstorms. So we've had thunderstorms and fireworks, and so she's been a little stressed.
Been nervous.
And I think they must be able to feel changes in pressure, because she'll start.
Barometric pressure.
Yeah, she'll start shaking, before storms happen, and there's no saying. And in fact, the other day, they were calling for a storm, and it didn't come, but she was shaking before, so she must feel pressure change. So, and she's now dealing with a human that is becoming really old, and whose arteries must be hardening even as we speak. Last Wednesday, after the study, I said, when I got back to the office, I said, darn, I didn't cancel the study for Wednesday, for next week, because we sure aren't going to meet on the 4th. That's ridiculous. And so all week long, I was thinking about it. All week long, I was thinking about it. So on Sunday, I, of course, said,
No Bible study.
no Bible study, because of the 4th. And now, I appreciate your kindness, but when I say something that is really stupid, give me some sign, because I'm looking out there and everybody is looking, and like, okay, and so I feel as though it's right, I did the right thing, and until the end, and as I was standing. Well, thank you very much, ladies. I sure appreciate it.
But I didn't want to embarrass you.
I also wondered, okay, maybe there's some rationale or reason on the fact. Maybe it was an extra holiday, and getting another day off.
His daughter was home or something.
Well, I'm thinking I did the right thing, and I'm fine with that. And as people are going.
Who corrects?
Well, Amy says. Amy and I take shut-in communion, and she said, "Are you free this week to do the shut-in communion?" I said, "Sure, I'm free this week. Let's do." She said, "What afternoon was best for you?" I said, "Well, Thursday or Friday would be best for me. Certainly don't want to do it on Wednesday. Don't want to do that on Wednesday." And she said, "Why not Wednesday?" And I said, "It's the 4th." And she said, "No, it's not." and so I paused. And what makes it so embarrassing, even worse, is my birthday is the 2nd.
Yeah.
And so I'm standing there and I'm thinking, today's my birthday. And then she says, I wondered why you said that. And I said, I don't know. And Beth Honk is standing behind her and says, yeah, I couldn't figure it out either why you said that. And I thought, well, I looked out, nobody gave any expression, not even confusion. It was
Not like,
You didn't look at me, I was confused. Why is he canceling?
I thought that was
Yeah, me
funny
too.
when they're having a day off after that.
yeah, I did too.
well, thank you. Everybody who heard it thought it was wrong, but nobody told me.
You know why?
Everybody is looking at me like,
It's an extra day.
if somebody had just said, it's Tuesday. It's Tuesday. I am seldom embarrassed. I live with being embarrassed. That's sort of a fact of life. So next time when I do something, and it will probably be on Sunday, it'll probably be something else on Sunday. Somebody just gently, just say,
From the back? You can't tell
Well,
me
you
from the
can-
back gently.
well,
I could go,
when I was, you talk about being in the back, when I was first starting, and we did very few funerals in funeral homes when I was in Montana, we always did it in churches. In fact, I only did, I think, maybe 2 in a funeral home in 5 years. But this was one of them. And I was doing this funeral and funeral home. And back in nowadays, it's tape music. They use CDs and digital music. But back then, because this is the 80s, they had an organist that would play. And his little organ was in the back, and he would play the music. And he was back then, people would sit, and I was in the front. And we were talking about the service, and we were just talking, and he was telling me about another minister that had missed a music in they were having a solo, and during the funeral had missed it. And of course, I was 26. I knew this. I knew how to be a minister. Gee, I'd been a minister for, like 8 months. So I knew this stuff. And so I was, kind of laughing. Oh, well, we're professionals. That won't happen. Anyway, so I do the service. I'm doing the service, and we're supposed to have a solo in the service. And he says, where do you want it? And I said, where do you want it? And he said, well, we'll put it at a natural break. And so we'll do it here before, I start speaking. I'll have a prayer, and then we'll put the music there, and then I'll speak. And so he said, okay, that's fine. And so I'm doing the funeral, and I'm on a roll. Because sometimes when you do a service, you feel it. And it's just flowing. It's just flowing. And I'm just in a flow. And things are moving. And so I say that prayer, and boom, move right into my little talk. And at the end of my little talk, got another little prayer, which is really nice. And as I finish, and I'm about to do this prayer that sort of ties it all together, I look, and he's in the back doing this. But nobody can see him but me, because everybody is looking at me, and it's a funeral, so everybody is looking like, and he's doing this at me. And when I see him doing it, I know what he's talking about. I know because you're talking about waving. I know exactly what he's talking about. I have missed this special music. I've missed it. But so what do I do now? I'm standing there. Everybody is looking at me, and he's waving. And so, do I announce it that we're going to have special music, which I wouldn't normally do because you just kind of flow into it. Yeah, it doesn't need to be announced. Or do I just then sit down? Well, I lean forward to announce it, and then I lean backward to sit down, and then I lean forward again to announce it, and then I lean back. I look like I'm in a shooting gallery. A target in a shooting gallery, because I'm going back and forth, and finally I just sit down, and they do the music. But after the service, man, I avoided him, because he wanted to talk to me. He wanted to talk to me, this 26-year-old professional. He wanted to have a conversation. So if you waved, I'd probably say, what? Because, Shelley, I have no problem saying, pointing you out.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I said
sometimes during sermons, I have no problem. Yeah, that would be good.
Well, that must be kind of like that elder that was serving communion on Sunday was sitting there grinning at you when she realized she had forgotten to put juice in the chalice.
I didn't say it. I didn't say anything. but when I picked it up and looked down,
I thought I forgot.
You slid right through that one.
yeah, that's right. I picked it up and it was, and then I look in it and there's nothing in there. And then, so I'm thinking, and I'll tell you, this is the real short. I'm looking at it, and so I don't know what exactly to do. Do you pretend like you're pouring pantomime, into a cup? Or do I turn and hide it and do it, which is kind of stupid, so I decided just to put it back down and go on. But one time, and this was at least 20 years, well, maybe 25 years ago, we're having a baptism in the church. And the family is there at the font. and we're all, and it's a very dignified thing. And I removed and there's no water. They didn't put water. The deacons were supposed to put water. That was their job, and they didn't put water. And so the family is there, and we're in the service, and I've started, and now I've started that. What do I do? If I announce there's no water in here, then it becomes awkward. The family's uncomfortable. I've embarrassed the deacon. I don't want to do that. So, I gotta admit, I did a dry baptism once. Kind of turned, so the parents couldn't see inside, and I put my hand in there, and I even flicked it. It was wet. So there's a child somewhere out there, not a child anymore, an adult, who got a dry baptism.
You could have just said, "Oh, somebody bring me some water."
Yeah, well, I had a glass of water. They used to give me a glass under the pulpit to speak, so I could have. And I thought about that.
Yeah,
Do I take that glass and pour it in there? And I thought that looks bad. Taking that glass and pour it because I'd sipped from it. What's that?
What did the gentleman say to you that had a dry baptism?
Well, it wasn't it was a baby. It was a baby, and that was so I had. Yeah, I didn't have the gentleman in my arms. That would be
You
rough.
said he wasn't
made
a
you
child
lean in
anymore.
there?
Oh, he's grown up. That was 25 years ago. So he is now an adult.
Probably happy about
What's that?
She has to
Baby
start
was-
cutting.
Oh, I'm sure the baby was fine.
Yeah, you didn't
That was fine.
wet it. So-
Yes, actually, the early church had like a manual on baptisms and what you could use, because in the Middle East, water is precious, and so there were ways you could do baptism without using water, and they allowed you to use. You could use, if there was no water available, you could use dust. You could use dust. Yeah, because the key wasn't how you did it, it was that you did it. And so what you used was of less secondary importance.
Well,
But we get all bent out of shape.
Where were you going to get the dust? Were you going to go around and go?
Well, I mean, like on the ground, if you're around
Oh,
a
it's
sand.
outside.
Yeah, outside.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you don't. You look under the bed and get a dust bunny and shove it on top. So okay. Well, we're looking at Exodus, and we're kind of coming down, and there's a lot of stuff we're going to cover, big pieces, because it'll be apparent when we do it. Now, we're in Exodus. Exodus is a continuation of the story we saw in Genesis. What has happened in Exodus to this point? We've got main characters, right? And what are the main characters?
Moses.
Moses is a main character. And Aaron. Moses and Aaron, sort of a tag team. And we've got Pharaoh, here. And we got the protagonists, the heroes, Moses and Aaron, and we got antagonists, which is Pharaoh. But who is really the main character of this story? God is the main character, because God is driving all of this. And as the story is put together, the writers have gone out of their way to take focus away from Moses and Aaron, and even away from Pharaoh. And what have they done to take a little bit of focus away from Moses and Aaron? What have they done to sort of not cause us to not say, wow, man, these are great guys. These are incredible guys. What has the writer done that would kind of cause us to pause before we say anything like that?
God told Moses.
God tells Moses,
prior
yes.
to whatever happens.
So God tells Moses what to do. Now everybody else heard that, right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
It's barber shave.
God tells him. What do we get about Moses' character?
It's obedient.
Well, he's obedient. But he complains.
He's not very like talkative or being able to present himself well. So Aaron
Yeah,
doesn't.
it's hard to look at Moses and say, "Wow, that's a hero."
Yeah.
That's a guy. Because when God says talk, he says, "I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't talk very well. You'll have to get somebody else. I really don't want to do this. What if they don't listen to me?" He's a little mealy. It's not, he's not the hero. He's a little kind of mealy with
Whiner.
it. Yeah, a little whining. And nobody likes a whiner.
Yeah, so
no.
stop whining.
Oh, okay. Wait until Sunday. So Moses, but the writer, I think that's very intentional because you don't want to focus. He doesn't want the reader to focus on Moses. Doesn't want him to focus on Moses. Focusing on Moses distracts us from focusing on God. In the same way with Pharaoh. He doesn't want us to focus on Pharaoh, right? Oh, Pharaoh was horrible. He was terrible. Because what's with Pharaoh? God does what?
Hardens his heart.
Hardens his heart. It's not that Pharaoh's a jerk. He may be a jerk, but that's not the reason this is happening. This is happening because God
set it up.
Do you think also the writer, intended, Moses was very human.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I can relate a lot to Moses.
Yeah.
Not that I could do what he did, but the fact that if I was given a hard task to do, I would kind of say, yeah, could you send somebody else?
Absolutely.
Nobody wants to be put out of their comfort zone.
Well, and when you think about it, and I think that's really good. When you think about the fact that this is being written way, it's not like a guy was following around, taking notes and writing up something immediately. This was written long, 1,000 years later. By what this is supposed to happen, when this is supposed to happen. And it's to educate people much later. Correct. Lord have mercy. For a writer to say, the guy that could be the hero has feet of clay. Wow. That's really impressive. Because as you're writing a saga about a hero, you may want to make the hero the hero. And the writer doesn't see him. Moses isn't a bad person, but he's
stubborn, isn't he?
Good question. Even in American history, when Parson Weems writes the biography of George Washington the year after he dies, he didn't write about George Washington being human. He writes about George Washington telling his father he cut down a cherry tree, had throwing $1 across the Potomac. He wrote about this Washington that the angels, when he died, the angels took him up into heaven. Parson Weems did not write an objective biography of George Washington because he wanted people later to view Washington as
a strong person.
As a hero,
yes.
A national hero,
this whole story
eternal
actually
hero.
puts more glory on God.
Absolutely.
God could use you, me, everybody else, lower people to do His greatness, so that we get none of the credit and He gets all of the credit. So I think that's why God could pick a really smart person to do His work, but it's not the person that's doing the work; it's God.
Exactly, and we saw that. Remember, we saw that in Genesis. Yeah, we saw that in Genesis. When we looked at the patriarchs are not good, necessarily great people. Some of them are not good at all. Right. Jacob's not good at all. But they all had problems, issues. The fact that they would include that is remarkable. Because you don't see that in ancient work. You don't see that when the Latins are writing about Julius Caesar. When he's writing about himself, you don't see that. You see very clear heroes and very clear villains. And that's kind of the way we think nowadays. The people we admire are heroes, the people we don't like are villains. Everything is black and white. And this is kind of nuanced here.
That's the divide between humanity and spirit.
Well, it would have been very easy for them to do that, and the evangelists did it too.
Did Moses stutter? That's what I was told.
Well, he says he didn't speak. Well, who knows what that meant? Yeah. In Hebrew, it doesn't refer to that. It's when, if I'm going to try to figure out what this means or why he wouldn't do it, when he says, don't speak well, well, why? Historically, why would that be the case? Yeah. Well, you can do that, but I think whenever we and we're going to see that today too, whenever we sort of put history into it, I think we kind of get distracted. We can get distracted from the meaning, because what we do is we isolate it into one event, and instead of making it an event that applies to all people at all times.
And Moses
We
was
isolated.
he was like an ordinary man. You know what I mean? There was
Yeah.
nothing special.
Nothing special about
And
this.
Aaron, kind of like Moses Aaron would do the speaking and Moses would do the
The stuff,
The-
the
yeah,
shtick.
yeah.
He'd do the shtick,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so we've got that. We went through the plagues, right? All 10 of them. And the plagues are intended to do what? What's the intention of the plagues? They have one
Attention
intention.
to God, listen to what God's saying.
Glory of God. Glory of God. And even when we have Pharaoh saying, go, go, what does the writer say? God hardened his heart and said, you got to stay. And so we have one plague after another. Now when we get into the beginning of chapter 12, we have come to the end of the plagues. And all of them, because God says, this is to show my glory. Again, we're privy to that. We, the reader, are hearing what God says, which means we're not part of the story. We're kind of looking down on the story. Okay, what happens at the beginning of chapter 12?
Oh, the Lord told Moses and Abraham.
Okay, the Lord is talking to Moses and Aaron,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And what does the Lord say?
That this month is to be for them. The first month
what-
of your year.
Yeah, he says this month is from now on going to be what?
Your year.
The first month of your year. Now, as soon as we hear that, we know what's about to happen. Something pretty big. Because their whole calendar is changed, and this is going to be the month. Now remember, one of the things that I've really encouraged you to do when you look at these stories is visualize a father talking to his son or to his daughter. And they're saying, Daddy, much later, you got all these traditions floating around, the people in the land. Daddy, why do we do this? Well, son, let me tell you. Let me tell you the story. And we got a story, and that's what we got here. Daddy, why is this the first month of our year? Well, let me tell you why. Because this is the month that will change Jewish history. This is going to be the defining month in Jewish history. Really interesting when you look at Judaism, this Exodus leaving Israel, or leaving Egypt, was sort of defining in Jewish history. That's kind of shifted a little bit. And a lot of modern Jews see another time as sort of the defining time in Jewish history. One that may be even a little bit more important than the Exodus. You got any idea what it would be? You see it in a lot of Jewish writing.
Passover?
Holocaust becomes the kind of the defining event, not the Exodus, but the Holocaust becomes kind of a defining event in the history of the Jewish people. It's interesting how they interpret this, but clearly he's writing to a people. This is being read by or to a people that see this as the defining event in their history, and he's explaining why it's so important. So you're going to make this month is so important. We're changing your whole calendar, and from now on, this is the first month of the year. And what does he tell the people to do?
Take a lamb.
Okay, you gotta take a lamb, right? And it's got to be a special lamb,
It
right?
has to be not very clean.
It's got to be without blemish. It's got to be clean. Now that's when we read that, you was thinking, okay, we're going to run into that later in Leviticus, because this is the kind of lambs you sacrifice, but we don't have anything about sacrifice yet, defining what you're supposed to sacrifice. You don't have it in the story. You don't have it in Genesis. Haven't had it in Exodus. It's going to come later. But it's kind of being projected back into this story. Again, why does the lamb have to be unblemished that we sacrifice?
Because of God.
Well, this is it. This is it. Okay, so what are they going to do with the lamb?
Kill it, eat it, but not
Okay.
use its blood.
On a certain day of the month, right? What day? 14th day. Not a shocker that it's a 14th day, because 14, if you break 14 into 2 equal parts, you've got 2 sevens, and 7 is a perfect number. So on the 14th day of the month, you are to do what?
Make that, sacrifice.
Okay, you're supposed to put first, you kill the lamb, you do what with the blood?
Put it above you.
Put it on the door, and then what do you do with the lamb?
Have to eat.
You eat it, you cook it.
He
But
said even the inside's in there.
that's right. Well, what do you vision? That's right, when they cook it, so you're cooking it over a fire, how are you cooking it?
Roasting it.
Yeah, you're roasting it like on a spit, is what you're doing, but you're not gutting it first.
Right.
You're just cooking it. You've skinned it, I guess. You have to skin it.
I would hope
But
so.
you're cooking it, roasting it on I would think maybe a spit, and you're to eat it. Now, what is being described here? With bitter herbs, right?
Yeah.
And unleavened bread. What's being described here?
Passover.
Okay, Passover. Now, this is really important. Passover isn't a day. We think of Passover being a day. The day of, but it isn't. Passover is not even a week. It's,
A month.
nope. Y'all are moving in the wrong direction.
A day.
It's a meal.
Oh, yeah.
It's a meal.
Oh, it's a meal.
It's a
Yeah.
meal. That's what it is. So it's not even a day. It's not like, oh, this is Passover. What are we going to do today? Because that's the end of what he's going to define later as the festival of unleavened bread, which is 7 days. This is the meal that culminates that period. So Passover is a meal and it's being defined. Now, the way it's being defined is detailed, right? Bitter herbs and you're cooking the lamb
And no unleavened bread.
And unleavened bread. Now, we're going to talk more about that later. Why so many details? Now, understand, this is being written to people that are already celebrating Passover. And they're not reading it and saying, oh, we haven't done it like this before. Let's start doing it this way.
I think it's all symbolic.
They are doing this. They're already doing this. So what the writer is doing is he's taking something that they've already done.
Established.
That's right, established, and doing what with it? Projecting it back. Like I said, kid going to his father, Daddy, why do we have lamb cooked in this special way with, bitter herbs and unleavened bread? Well, son, let me tell you. And this is a story that becomes the basis. We see the same thing going on in the New Testament. In the Gospels, when they talk about, communion images, they aren't reading that and saying, oh, what an interesting way to do communion. I think we'll do it that way now. They're already doing it. What they're doing is they're putting what they're doing in the words of Jesus. This is why we're doing it. Goes back to Jesus, but they're already doing it, right? Because it's a tradition that's been passed on. So it's giving divine sanctions, establishes it with divine meaning. And that's why you got all the detail here. But the Passover is a meal. Now, what is going to happen? Why is this such a defining time? Why is this meal so important? What is going to happen around them that makes this meal? Because it's really, the meal is almost incidental to what God is doing
He's
in
showing him
Egypt.
food.
What is God going to be doing in Egypt?
Killing.
The firstborn's going to die. The firstborn's going to die. And it's going to be the firstborn of the Egyptians, and not just people, but animals too. Now, one of the things and again, I would really caution you to not put too much history, in here. Listen to it as a story that has meaning to us now, and not an event that's isolated back in time. Remember, one of the plagues was that the livestock died. So what livestock is if it's the firstborn of the livestock? What is he talking about? Livestock, because they're already dead. That was one of the plagues. So that's why we don't want to get too hung up on historicity. It distracts us from the meaning of the story. We start trying to explain it and shifting things around to make it. And we're wasting our time. We're distorting the story. Let's stick with the story. So this is going to be a dramatic, cataclysmic event in Egypt, right? Okay. So not only, so we got a meal, Passover meal. This is going to be the way they can remember this incredible event, right? By this meal. Another festival is introduced. What's the other festival that's introduced? That again, the Jews are going to end up celebrating, because we know they are, because they describe it in other places later, that they are celebrating Passover. What's the other festival that's prescribed here? So the Passover is a meal. What leads up to the meal? The Feast of Unleavened Bread. And unleavened bread is what?
No yeast.
Okay, you got no yeast in it. Okay. And what's the issue with yeast? What is?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, now think about it. What is that time, the time before Passover? Why is it unleavened bread? One, yeast is really a kind of a tricky thing, because what does yeast do? Jesus uses yeast as an example in a parable, right? Parable of the lump of dough. What does yeast tend to do to dough?
It overtakes.
It overtakes
and it fills up.
Yeah, and Jesus will say, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Yeah, because what will happen is you put a little bit in, even a tiny bit, and it doesn't affect a little bit. It affects it all. So be careful. A little bit into the lump of dough will affect the whole shooting match. But I don't think that's what's so much with yeast. That's floating around in the background. So a lot of times people view yeast as almost a corrupting influence. Yeast is something that changes. It grows and you don't see it, but it's happening. And all of a sudden it's changed. But I don't think that's the main emphasis here. What's the emphasis with this unleavened bread?
I think the leavened bread for me is, it symbolizes sin.
Well, it certainly could. What's happening here? And he even says it. Why are you going to continue to eat unleavened bread? What is the reason for this having unleavened bread? If I've got a bread machine at home, and it's really cool. I've had one for years. This is the third one I've had. I love it. And you put the flour and the milk and the butter and the salt and the sugar into this pan, and you just put it in there, and you put the pan in this little machine. It's got a little rotor on the bottom. Put it in the machine, and then up on top there's a lid you open, and you put in your yeast. And what it will do, and you can set a time, you can make it or set a time. It takes 4 hours to make, or you can do it 4 hours with a timer. And it will mix it and then release the yeast. But it doesn't just constantly mix it, it lets it rise. It takes 4 hours because, at a minimum of 4 hours, because
it's got to rise.
It's got to rise, right? And then it gets mixed again, and then it rests for more time, so it rises. If I'm making bread with yeast, what do I need? What do I need? I need flour, I need butter, I certainly need sugar, I want salt, water, whatever. What else do I need? Or I can't make bread. I gotta have time. Because I gotta let it rise, right? It's gotta rise.
Rises twice.
That's right. I gotta have a lot of time. This is unleavened bread, which means it's bread without you don't need to take the time to let it rise. Right? What does this represent for the Jews? Why is unleavened bread so important when you're talking about the Exodus?
Pure.
Well, right? Let's move away though from the pure. Let's be very practical about this. Unleavened bread, why is that so important to the Exodus? They gotta have it for the trip. And they're not gonna, when God says go,
you go.
They can't say, oh, well, the bread will be ready in 3 hours. So, give me 3 hours and I'll be ready to go.
And they can pack it into, you know.
You make it like that. Now, so what this unleavened bread represents is what?
Quick retreat.
Quick response. That you got to respond quickly. And that's why it becomes associated with this. It becomes associated because when God calls you to go, you go. My gosh, even after you eat it says with the lamb on the Passover meal, it's very clear. Well, I got leftovers, right? It's hard to eat a whole lamb, so there are leftovers. I got Tupperware.
You're not allowed to eat it.
I'm not allowed to eat it. I've got to
Get rid of it.
I got to get rid of it. I got to burn it because you don't take it with you. Because the Exodus is focused on when God says go, you go. And you got to go at a moment's notice. So you don't take time to make bread that has to rise. You use unleavened bread. So it's this response. I've got to respond to God. Again, a little boy, Dad, why don't we eat bread with yeast? Because they had bread with yeast. It's not unusual. In fact, bread with yeast is better. It's good. Why do we have unleavened bread for this? Well, let me tell you the story. Your ancestors had to leave Egypt on a moment's notice. And God said, you can't wait for the bread to rise. You got to have unleavened bread.
Is that, okay, so that, wow, this verse just came to my head, was like, and I'm going to misquote this, but you'll know what I mean. When you put your hand on the plow, you don't turn back.
Yeah, that's right. That's what Jesus said when the guy says that, I want to follow you.
Don't worry about the bread.
That's right. That's right. Man, you got to go. That's a great analogy because that's exactly what he's saying. Yeah. And you know what this bread's going to do? Every time you look at that unleavened bread, it reminds you of the Exodus. And every time you have this meal, reminds you of the Exodus. Every time Christians gather around the table and have communion, it reminds you of
crucifixion.
Jesus sharing it with his disciples. That's what these rituals do. They remind you of something else, and that's what's happening.
And they don't allow other people to eat it.
Right.
Nobody else can eat it.
Why is it? And all this prescriptive say, well, if you got a slave, they can't unless the slave is circumcised, and then he can, but he can't. Why are they doing that? Why is all of those details? And remember, they're writing it on papyrus for crying out loud. It's not like me writing it on my computer, and I can use words everywhere. They're writing it on papyrus. Every word is valuable. They're putting a lot of detail into this stuff. Why would they be putting so much detail into it?
So it wouldn't be forgotten.
So it wouldn't be forgotten. And it's something that they're already doing. God's people are special. That's why they're God's people. And notice when they talk here, they talk about Israelites. They're not talking about the other word we've run across a lot in Exodus. What's the other word?
Oh.
That generally refers to this group. Not Roman, but another word that we
Egyptian.
Not Jewish.
Egyptian.
Hebrew.
Hebrew.
Not talking because Hebrew, like I told you, Hebrew is a class. It's a derogatory term for a group of people that included Israelites. Now he's talking about Israelites. God's people. Okay, what does Moses do? Now, these two festivals, then, that people are doing when they're reading Exodus, what has the writer of Exodus done? He's grounded both of them in God. Both of them are grounded. We do it because of God. Okay.
Oh, so they weren't allowed to eat it outside their house.
That's right. That's right. Why? Doesn't matter why.
Yeah, that's really.
Doesn't matter why. What matters is that's the way they're doing it.
Yeah.
And it's really cool. And they're going to do the same thing with the law. You take it, what you do, and you put it in the hands of God. We do it because God told us to do it. People have forgotten that. Why are we doing these things? Well, let me tell you the story. So what you're doing is you're putting it back in the hand. We do it as Americans, kind of politically. Well, what do our founders say? We got to go and think what our founding fathers said. What was their opinion? We're doing the same thing. What is their opinion about, cybersecurity? They didn't have an opinion about it. But how can we project it back on them? That's what people do. To all of a sudden give meaning to what we're doing right now. You project it onto something that is past, you're projecting it back onto God. And that's what the writer is doing. And it's an absolutely crucial thing for people to have what they do be not only endorsed, but prescribed by God. Moses tells the people to do it, and what do the people do? Now, how have the people been responsive to Moses in the past? When he's gone to talk to the leaders. Have they said, yeah, Moses, you speak up? No, they haven't liked anything he said. In fact, they complained about the plagues because the Egyptians made life harder because of Moses. And they had a problem with Moses. When Moses tells them, this is what we're going to do, this is what's going to happen, how do they respond?
They get angry.
Well, here, do they get angry? No. They say, okay, all right. In fact, it's kind of funny. He even the writer ties it to the future. He tells them to do exactly what I'm saying he's doing. In verse 26. Notice in verse 26, what does it say?
You said 46.
26.
113?
Mm-hmm. No, chapter 12. Back in 12.
Still in 12, okay.
Yeah.
26.
What does it say in 26?
And when your children ask,
when your children ask,
what does this ceremony mean?
That's what he's doing. He's giving meaning to people later. This is an educational thing. And he's putting this into God's hands. When your children ask, why do we do it this way? What are you supposed to do?
Tell them.
Tell them the story. Tell them the story. And that's why I think the story is so crucially important. Not only this story, but our stories. Why our stories are so important.
Well, that's why you pass on to your children.
That's what the church needs to do. And sometimes we've done it well, and sometimes we haven't. Mm-hmm. I don't know that the church has always been the church, big church, American church. We've been all that good passing on the stories. And I think we're seeing the result of that. But that's just my opinion. But that's what he says, and the people respond by worshiping God, right? Now, that's what we got. What happens to the Egyptians now? This is what God's done. He's given this story, prescribed it. What's happened happens, right? And the Egyptians are struck down. And what's coming out of Egypt? What does he say? As a result of the firstborn dying, what ends up happening?
They're let go.
They're crying. There's a cry throughout Egypt, right? And this is based on what he's already said. How do we interpret this? What is the death of the firstborn to the Egyptians? What is it? How do we interpret that? How do we take that? What is it? Is it the Egyptians are bad people being punished for their sins? What is this?
Showing God's power.
Showing God's power. That's exactly, it's a display of God's power. Now, really important as we do this, because we look at this and say, and Paul recognizes that, and that's why in the 9th chapter of Romans, Paul says, I know what you're thinking about this. And it doesn't sound like this is pretty bad that these guys are dying. That's not a good thing, right? That's why it's really important. But Paul says, you got to understand, this is a display of God's power, but you have to understand his will. And what is God's will, Barb? Mercy and compassion. This may not appear to be the case with the firstborn dying. And I'll tell you, if I read this, I'll guarantee you that if I read this to Maggie's friends, they'd say, no way I'm going to worship that God. I'm not going to worship a God that kills babies. You know, geez Louise. You know, and he killed innocent Egyptian babies. So now I want to make the Egyptians all the Egyptians really bad. This isn't what it's about. It's about a display of God's power. And Paul says, yes, that is a problem unless you view God's power as mercy and compassion. And that death is not the worst thing that can happen. You know, that God did this in order to be merciful and compassionate to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians. Ultimately, to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians. Okay. And that's the only way it can make sense. But we really don't, I don't think we want to cheapen it and say, well, it was their fault. Nothing in the story says it was. This is a display of God's power. It's just a display of God's power. Okay, so the Egyptians, this happens and Pharaoh ends up doing what? Go. And not only go, but go quickly and take remember one of the things was, you know, you could go, but we don't want you to take your kids. We don't want you to take your livestock. You know, because we want you to what? Come back. Yeah. So we don't want you to take everything. Now Pharaoh is saying, take everything, right? And go. And what do the people, and go quickly, what do the people do?
Laugh.
Fortunately, they had unleavened bread.
Oh.
Because they didn't have to tell Pharaoh, well, you know, should be in 4 hours. We should be ready to hit the road. You know, they could pack it up and go. But even more than that, what do they end up taking with them?
Jewels.
Oh, they take the gold and silver of the Egyptians and the clothing. And so they take everything and they're going out, right? And they leave. And how many does he say? Leaves, how much do the right? How many Israelites?
Over 600,000.
Okay, 600,000 besides
That's
children.
just men, yeah.
So you got a whole bunch, and what do they take with them? As though we need to be reminded.
Unleavened.
We hear the unleavened bread again. They're taken with them, and what information does the writer give us? Or the redactor, as he puts these stories together, what information as they are leaving, what information does he give?
They've been there
He
for 130 years.
tells them how long. Tells us, the writer, or the reader, how long they've been there, right?
Yeah, a long time.
They've been there a long time. Now, what does the Lord say to Moses and Aaron?
These are the regulations for Passover.
Yeah, we got more regulations for Passover. So what's being prescribed is something that doesn't mean anything here, but does have meaning
In the future.
in the future. Okay. And in fact, we've got a third tradition introduced at the beginning of 13. So we've got Passover, which is a meal. We've got the time leading up to Passover, begins on a Sabbath, ends on a Sabbath. Even if it's not the Sabbath, you know, that's of unleavened bread. Now we got another tradition that's established. What is that?
No foreigners eat of it unless he's circumcised.
Okay, about being circumcised, have to be circumcised. Beginning of 13, what does it mention?
Consecrate.
Okay, now it's this little thing about consecrating, right? And what is he talking about with the consecrating? Tell me what is being prescribed. Again, it's something that the Jews, when they read this, know about.
They've been set apart.
Boom. What's set apart?
From others.
What does he say? The firstborn. He talks about the firstborn. And the firstborn is what? What's about the firstborn?
First son's in the cattle, your male shall be the Lord's.
Belongs to the Lord. The firstborn, whether it's a cow or whether it's a kid, and I'm not talking about a goat, the firstborn
Belongs to him.
belongs to
Wow.
the Lord. Okay, so we've got, and why? Why would this be appropriate that the firstborn goes to the Lord? Why does that, in this context, why does that make sense?
Reminding them of what went on.
That's it, reminding of what's going on. And God took the firstborn of the Egyptians, but didn't take the firstborn of the Israelites. And the Lord could have, but didn't. Therefore, the firstborn belongs to God. The firstborn belongs to God. Now, this becomes really very important because historically, the firstborn is not, everybody's not presenting that to God. The firstborn child. Although the whole story of Samuel is going to center around this. You know, how Samuel ends up where he does with Eli. Because he's firstborn. What will the Israelites, what will the Jews do with this firstborn business that evidently is part of their culture that, you know, gets kind of projected back? How do you get around? I mean, one, you present the firstborn to the priest. Say, here's a baby. Priest, here's a baby. Does the priest want that baby?
No.
Heck no. The baby's only going to eat. You know, the baby isn't going to be productive until it's old enough to be productive. They don't want that. So what ends up being, how are the Jews going to still keep this as a tradition that the firstborn belongs to God, but not make it quite as tangible? What they're going to do is you can buy it back. If you have a firstborn child, you can take the firstborn, you can sort of buy it back from the priest. You present priest an offering and you get your child back. And so it becomes becomes the tradition. So you offer something to the priest for your firstborn, and you're supposed to do it for your livestock. And they're not going to do it because people don't do that kind of stuff. You know, but it shows that the people later kind of drift away from the ideal. Okay. So anyway, we got these traditions establishing what the people are doing in the Lord. Now in verse 17, we got all this tradition done, you know, explained in great detail. What happens in verse 17 of 13? Because we're back to the story.
Pharaoh let the people go.
Okay.
But God did not lead them on
God-
the road through.
To the Philistines.
Yeah.
Now, the Philistines are along the coast because the goal is to lead the people where? Where are they going? They're going to Canaan. And in fact, it mentions, you know, the people that are living in Canaan, the Hittites and the Jebusites and all the other ites, you know, that are living in the land, the Canaanites, all of those guys, you know, they hear what's going on in Egypt and they get a little nervous. Because that's where the Jews are going to go. It'd be easy to go along the coast, right in there. But God is, again, who's in charge? God is in charge, is leading them, you know, leading them away. And it explains, because the people that are reading this know about the wandering in the wilderness. They've heard stories about it. And what the writer is, he's giving details about it. You know, okay. Well, and so they end up going another way, and they go directed towards where? They go towards the Red Sea. Now, you know, if you look at stuff, you know, some of the stuff written, you know, Red Sea, Sea of Reeds, my opinion, only my opinion, if you want to get excited about it, that's great. Waste of time. Waste of time. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's a Sea of Reeds, doesn't matter if it's a Red Sea. I don't care. It says Red Sea. I will deal with Red Sea. You know, because I'm not looking at this primarily as a historical event locked in time. Rather, I'm looking at a story that has meaning forever. And so I'm not sweating out where exactly they go because I don't care. You know, I want to deal with the story as it is. Now, if you do, that's fine. That's fine with me. You know, I don't. It's your business. But I don't think that enhances. You know, whether it's a Sea of Reed or the Red Sea. I don't think it really matters that much.
But I like the idea that God does that because of, like you said, the people are if they run into a war, they might retreat, oh, I
Right.
don't want to deal with a war, let's go back to Egypt, we were better.
Right, right. And
So
since,
he keeps them away from that.
yeah, and since the children of Israel will never want to go back to Egypt once they leave.
Yeah, right.
Like every single day, they'll complain about going back to Egypt. That's constant. Yeah, but what it does is explains why, right from the beginning, how did they end up in the Sinai Peninsula? Why weren't they along the coast? Well, let me explain that to you. This is the reason. Anyway, they're going to the Red Sea, like I said. Who do they carry with them? Because they're not going empty-handed. They carry Joseph's bones, right? And that becomes important because
Joseph said that's what he wanted.
Joseph said, that's what I wanted, and he's one of the sons of Jacob, so he's going to be buried in the land, and they are going, and what is leading them?
Cloud.
A pillar of cloud. Now you say, whoa, that's really good. That's really impressive, right? Well, in Hebrew, the word for cloud is a Hebrew word called kavod. Kavod is the word for cloud. Kavod is also the Hebrew word for glory. And so when you see clouds talked about, not only in the Old Testament, also in the New Testament, it kind of has a dual meaning. It's not just cloud, it also refers to God's glory. When Ezekiel is going to have visions later because Ezekiel is going, when the Jerusalem is conquered by the Babylonians, Ezekiel is going to have a vision. He's already been taken into captivity. But he's going to have a vision of the glory of God leaving the temple. And he's going to describe it as a cloud. The cloud leaves the temple. So when the Babylonians take Jerusalem, God is not in his temple. God has left. So they're not conquering God. He's already gone. So they're being led by
Glory of God.
the glory of God. Transfiguration, when Jesus talks about a cloud surrounding him. Boy, that's heavy duty. Doesn't mean the same thing in Greek, but it does in Hebrew. And if you're Hebrew, have a Hebrew background, and you hear cloud, you're thinking cloud, glory, tomato. It's the same sort of deal. Okay, so they're being led by the glory of God, which is showing what? God is
In charge.
in control and is with them, right? Right at the beginning of 14, what does God tell Moses?
Tells them to turn back.
Yeah, I got good news and bad news for you, right? You're in the land, right? We're heading out. Pharaoh thinks that you're just wandering around, right? And since Pharaoh thinks that, what is Pharaoh going to do?
He kind of says, why did I let them go to begin with? Let's
Yeah,
look at
he's
that.
going to say, Pharaoh, now, it's interesting. He says, Pharaoh's going to say, why did I let him go? And he's going to try to do what?
Go get them.
Go get him. Now, who's in charge of this?
God's in charge.
God's in charge of this, right? This isn't something that God, is, Moses, let me give you a warning. Pharaoh's really, God is in control of this. And in fact, he says, what is the fact that Pharaoh's going to come after you, what is this going to ultimately show?
Who's in charge?
Who's in charge? And who's in charge?
God.
God's in charge, right? And what happens with Pharaoh?
He hardens his heart.
That by gum, that's what he does. And we know because the writer tells us. Why does Pharaoh say decides to go after the
Losing
Jews?
all his workers.
He said, that's what he says to them. He says, man, we're losing our workers. We got to get them back. But we know, because we see verse 8, why does he actually do this? Because God hardens his heart. Pharaoh thinks he's in charge, but is he?
No.
Heck no, he's not in charge. Heck no, he's not in charge. He's just like a pawn in a game. He's just being moved around, right? Now the Israelites don't know this. What do they feel when they look back? Oh, they're a faithful people, right? What do the Israelites do?
They're kind of spoiled. They think, if they go back to Egypt.
Yeah, well, they say to Moses, poor old Moses. What do they say to him? Why did you bring us here to die in this desert? You know, why didn't you just let us stay in Egypt? It wasn't that bad. Van, it wasn't that bad, was it?
No.
You were just making bricks. That's
Yeah.
all they were doing.
And
You
they
know.
need no yeast.
Yeah, need no yeast, that's right. You know, later, you know, one of the things I love, we'll see it. The Israelites will go to Moses and say, remember when the good old days back in Egypt. We could eat, and I always thought, we could eat leeks. Remember the days when we could eat all the leeks we wanted. Now, I don't know that anybody I have ever known would say, I want to eat, my idea of a dream is eating all the leeks I can possibly eat.
No.
You know, they don't have all-you-can-eat leek buffets. You know what I'm saying?
They have days that they do the leeks, but no, it's not.
They don't have at Golden Corral
Right.
the leek bar.
Right.
You know, that's not a big seller. They don't advertise. You know, this month is leek month. Now, so, you know, but again, I think this is interesting because it would be so easy for this writer to portray Moses as spiritually superior and the people as spiritually superior. These are your forefathers. Boy, they were faithful. In fact, it's kind of remarkable that these guys are not very good. You know, they're complainers. They are complaining, right? And what does Moses say?
Or not to be afraid.
Don't be afraid.
The Lord will fight for you.
God is going to fight for you. What's the response of the Lord? Poor
Why are you
Moses.
crying out?
Why are you crying to me? Moses is in between, right? Mm-hmm. And what does he tells them exactly what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
The Egyptians are there. Now, it's interesting because, and I think that's why the Red Sea may be a little more symbolically important. Because what's gonna happen? They're being led by the glory of God.
He told Moses to raise his staff.
Okay, going to raise his staff. We've all seen Charlton Heston do that.
Yeah.
He's going to raise his staff, and what's going to happen?
The water separates.
The water's going to separate. Now, that's pretty dramatic. Cecil B. DeMille did it really well. Right?
Yes.
Oh, it's a good thing. You know, Charlton Heston with his hair combed back. Looks good. Now, but they're going through water. Why does it? And that's why I think Red Sea it becomes more important than Sea of Reeds. Because Sea of Reeds is a swamp. That's what it is. It's just a swamp. What did we say back in Genesis? Water represented to ancient people. What was water?
Life.
Well, it was life to the Egyptians. Yes. What was it in creation? Genesis 1. Genesis 1, the first chapter of Genesis. Yes. Life, that's exactly it. Water becomes a symbol of chaos. Becomes a symbol of chaos. Remember, because at the beginning, Genesis 1, God doesn't create out of nothing. Genesis 1, the Spirit hovers on the face of the deep. In the beginning, there was water. And God brought order, created a bubble out of the water. Because water becomes this image, this symbol for chaos in the ancient world. Makes sense. You're looking out at the Mediterranean Sea. Man, you got ships going out there. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. You look there, you see storms over there. You know, they didn't have dragons living on dry land. You know, they had sea monsters though in the water. You had Leviathan that was hanging out, and Behemoth that was hanging out in the water. Because the water was this uncontrollable, strange place where you go out and sometimes you don't come back. Symbol of chaos. That's why in the New Testament, when Jesus stills the storm, that's more than just a climactic miracle. You know, he is stilling chaos, this watery chaos. It's a big deal in the ancient world. And that's separating the waters. What is the Lord doing? Taking control of
what's going on and showing the Egyptians.
Yeah, well, chaos.
Yes.
Yeah, this is one. That's why the wall of order becomes really. God is doing what? Holding this chaos back, right? So He has control over chaos. You know, Sea of Reeds. Well, the Egyptians, their chariots got stuck in the mud and they couldn't go further. Okay, fine. If you want to do that, fine. Go for it. Be happy. I'd rather see Cecil B. DeMille, God taking control of chaos, separating the chaos, and allowing His people to do what? Cross over on dry land. And that ends up being what happens. They cross over on dry land, and the Spirit, the glory of the Lord stands between them and the Egyptians, right? So the Egyptians can't overtake them, the people get across, and the Egyptians come in, and what ends up happening?
The water disappears.
That's right, releases the restraint He's put on the chaos, and the water comes back. And chaos reasserts itself. Remember, the whole story of the flood is a story of God releasing chaos again on creation. You know, allowing the windows of the sky to be open and the springs of the deep. All He does is He removes the protection He gives His little bubble. That's what He's doing here. You know, and the Egyptians end up drowning in this chaos. This chaos overcomes them. And what happens in chapter 15? And I read at the end, before we even 15, at the very end of 14, just so that we might miss the meaning of this story, the writer tells us what? The Israelites saw what the Lord did against the Egyptians.
I love that message through this whole passage, and Shelley had brought it out, and you were agreeing with that when Moses said, "Fear not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord." When we're talking about the chaos.
Yeah.
And for me personally, and in everybody's life, that's what we're to do.
Absolutely.
God, we are to fear not, because that's of the enemy. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. What will be, and God's in control.
God
You're
is
His child. Now, what better place can you be?
That's exactly. And see, that's why I like so much, if we read it as I think it was written, intended to be written, you know, as a story, all of a sudden it has that meaning. If it's an isolated historical event, like a snapshot, then what God did here is fine, but maybe He does it now, maybe He doesn't. You know, this was a certain circumstance, only did it once. You know, no. This is a story that has meaning that resonates. And that's why when you read it like that, all of a sudden it becomes alive. That's why the Jews focus so much on word, because word is story. And story has meaning that transcends time. Images don't. Images don't. Right.
Today, yesterday, forever.
Images
It's what
are
we stand on.
locked in time. One of the great books, and if you, well, I thought it made a big difference to me, it was a man named Jacques Ellul wrote it. And it was called The Humiliation of the Word. And what he says in the thesis of his book is, God spoke to people in story. And that's one reason the Jews are so hesitant about images. Because what an image, he says, people process stories different than photographs. When you look at a photograph, that is a moment in time. Even you look at a movie, that's a moment in time. And you process it different because that's what happened then. That's what we do with photographs. Look at the people. Stories, on the other hand, have the ability to transcend time. And all of a sudden, stories have meaning that can be applied to different times. And your mind visualizes the characters, and you create the movie. That's happening in your brain. You lose that with a picture, with an image. And that's why he said we want to be really careful before we convert the Bible into an image, into images, because it locks it in time. Okay, then in chapter 15 is really easy. We don't have to spend much time on 15 because what's happening in chapter 15?
Song praises.
Yeah, we got to. Now, if we saw this, when you're looking at your Bible, that looks like a song, right? Looks like you see it in the song because
It is.
that's what it is. That's what it is. It's a poem. You know, it's a poem. You know, we were talking about it in the Sunday school class, you know, about poetry. And you look at it as a poem. And what's the poem about?
Life.
Well, it's about what
Happened.
and what what just happened. It's a poem about recounting what happened in a poetic form. You know, recreates what happened in a poetic form. So when we get to the end of chapter 15, where are we in this story?
They went into the desert of Shur.
Okay, now we're moved past, right? The Egyptians are gone. And we're not going to worry about Egyptians anymore, except that the people are going to do what? We want to go to Egypt. We want to eat more leeks. We're willing to make bricks. You know, the people are constantly going to want to go back, you know, back to Egypt. But the Egyptians, they're gone. The Egyptians are gone. You know, we're not going to see them anymore. They're kind of out of the story. Just, they're going to be this constant temptation, though, that the people are going to want to go back, to. Now, the next place for the people to go is where? Where are the people heading? Well, they're going in the desert. What are they going to do? Are they just going to hang out in the desert? Well, they are. But is that right now? Are they just hanging out in the desert? And now, they're heading where? To the promised land, right? They're heading to the promised land. And that's why he's already said the people in the land are sweating bullets that you got all these Israelites heading to take their land. Now, are they going to head right to the land? Heck no. They are not going to head to the land. They've got some time in the wilderness to spend. But we have entered a new phase in the story. Okay, any questions about this culmination? I think this is really, really cool. Not only what it says, but why it's saying it. I think it's just fascinating what's going on here. Any questions? Well, then let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time to sort of go through your word. Remind us that so much of what we do is grounded in you, that you are ultimately in charge. And when it feels as though we have no place to go, or when it feels as though chaos is lapping at our door, help us to simply trust that you have not stepped back and given up control. You are still in control. It may not be in the time we would want, but you are ultimately going to lead us in a path that will culminate in mercy and compassion. Remind us of that, because that's your story. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.